We are told that World War I began with an assassin's bullet in Sarajevo. We are taught that empires fell because of armies and generals. We think the map of the Middle East was carved up because of politics and religion. But that is the sanitized version of history, the version that hides the ledger. On November 11, 1918, when the guns finally went silent, the Ottoman Empire did not fall because it lost battles. It fell because it was bankrupt. It fell because a single railway project bled it dry and turned it into collateral for the most ruthless foreclosure in history. Let me show you what really happened. Let me show you how Britain did not fight to stop an army. It fought to stop a train. At the dawn of the 20th century, the British Empire was the most powerful economic machine ever constructed. It controlled 1/4 of the Earth's land surface. Its navy ruled every ocean. Its banks financed every continent. The system ran on one simple principle: control the routes and you control the trade. Control the trade and you control the world. The Suez Canal was the crown jewel of this system. Every ton of goods moving from Europe to Asia had to pass through that narrow strip of water in Egypt. Britain owned it. Britain taxed it. Britain could shut it down with a single cable from London. This was not just military power. This was a monopoly on global logistics. If you wanted to ship German steel to India, you paid Britain. If you wanted to move French wine to China, you paid Britain. The entire global economy funneled through British checkpoints. It was the most profitable toll booth in human history. But in 1888, something terrifying appeared on the horizon. A German banker named Georg von Siemens walked into the court of Sultan Abdul Hamid II in Constantinople with a proposal. He offered to build a railway that would connect Berlin to Baghdad, a continuous iron road stretching from the heart of industrial Europe all the way to the Persian Gulf. No British ships, no Suez tolls, no checkpoints, just steel and steam cutting straight through the Ottoman Empire and bypassing the entire British system. The Sultan looked at the map and saw salvation. Germany looked at the map and saw empire. Britain looked at the map and saw the end of the world. Let me paint you a picture of what the Ottoman Empire looked like in 1888. On paper, it still looked magnificent. It stretched from the Balkans to Yemen. It controlled Mecca and Medina. It ruled over Arabs, Turks, Kurds, Armenians, and Jews. The Sultan's palace glittered with gold. His treasury was staffed by hundreds of clerks. But if you looked at the actual numbers, you would see something very different. You would see an empire drowning in debt. The Ottomans owed British banks over 200 million pounds. They owed French banks another 150 million francs. The interest payments alone consumed 40% of the government's annual revenue. In 1881, the empire had officially gone bankrupt. The creditors had demanded collateral. So the Sultan was forced to sign over control of his own tax system to something called the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. This was a council of European bankers who literally collected the money from Ottoman citizens. If a merchant in Damascus sold tobacco, the profit did not go to Constantinople. It went to a vault in London. If a farmer in Anatolia paid his salt tax, the cash was shipped to Paris. The empire had become a subsidiary of foreign capital. Sovereignty had been replaced by insolvency. Abdul Hamid II understood what was happening. He knew that his empire was being asset stripped. He knew that if he could not break free from this debt slavery, the empire would be carved up and sold for parts. He needed infrastructure. He needed a way to move troops quickly to defend his borders. He needed to connect the industrial centers of Europe to the resource wealth of his territories. But he could not ask Britain or France to build it. They were the ones bleeding him dry. So he turned to Germany. Germany was hungry. Germany was powerful. And Germany was desperate. Here is what people forget about Germany in 1900. It was the second largest industrial economy in the world. Its factories produced more steel than Britain. Its chemists were inventing synthetic dyes and fertilizers that revolutionized agriculture. But Germany had no empire. It had no colonies in Africa or Asia. It had no access to cheap rubber or cotton or oil. Worst of all, it had no way to bypass the British Navy. Germany was a giant trapped in a box, and the Baghdad Railway was the key to breaking out. Think about the geometry of this project. A train could leave Berlin loaded with machinery and weapons. It would travel through Austria-Hungary, cross into Ottoman territory, pass through Anatolia, and roll all the way to Basra on the Persian Gulf. From there, German goods could be shipped to India, China, and the East Indies. No British warships could stop it. No Suez Canal fees could tax it. It would create a second circulatory system for global trade that operated entirely outside British control. And there was something else, something buried beneath the desert sand along the route of that railway. Oil. In 1900, the world still ran on coal, but naval engineers were beginning to realize that oil was superior. It burned hotter. It produced more energy per ton. Ships powered by oil could travel faster and stay at sea longer. Admiral John Fisher, the head of the Royal Navy, declared that Britain's future survival depended on converting the fleet to oil. But Britain had no oil, not a single drop on its islands. It had to import every barrel from Persia or the United States. And then the geologists started talking. They said that the land beneath Mesopotamia, the territory that the Baghdad Railway would cross, was sitting on an ocean of petroleum. The German engineers knew this. They had secured mineral rights for 20 kilometers on either side of the railway tracks. If the line was completed, Germany would not just control a trade route. It would control the fuel supply of the 20th century. It would control the energy that powered the British Navy. Let that sink in. The empire that ruled the seas would have to buy its lifeblood from its greatest rival. The British government went into full panic mode. In 1903, the Committee of Imperial Defense held a secret meeting in London. The conclusion was simple and brutal. The Baghdad Railway could not be allowed to reach the sea. If it did, the entire structure of British global dominance would collapse. So they went to work. First, they tried diplomacy. British agents traveled to Kuwait, a small sheikdom at the southern end of the planned railway route. They offered the local sheik money and protection in exchange for a secret agreement. The sheik signed a treaty promising not to lease any land to foreign powers without British approval. This was a legal blockade. The railway now had no terminal on the Gulf. It led to nowhere. Then they used the press. British newspapers launched a coordinated propaganda campaign. They called the railway a tool of German imperialism. They accused the Ottomans of oppressing Christians along the route. They painted the project as a barbaric invasion of civilization. public opinion in London turned hostile. Any British investor who tried to fund the railway was branded a traitor. Finally, they used finance. The City of London, the financial heart of the world, refused to underwrite any bonds related to the project. They pressured French banks to do the same. They tried to strangle the railway with a credit embargo. But the Germans kept building. Deutsche Bank poured millions of marks into the project. German engineers blasted tunnels through the Taurus Mountains. German laborers laid tracks across the Syrian desert. By 1914, the railway had reached southern Turkey. It was 90% complete. The nightmare was becoming real. Now let me show you what war actually costs. We think of World War I as a conflict about honor and alliances. We think the Ottomans joined Germany because of ideology. That is not what happened. The Ottomans joined the war because of the balance sheet. By 1914, the empire owed so much money to Britain and France that it could not function. The debt service was crushing the government. The Sultan's advisors told him that the only way to escape this trap was to win a war that would wipe out the creditors. If Germany won, the debts to London and Paris would be cancelled. The railway would be finished. The empire would be reborn. It was a gamble, a desperate bet on a German victory. But the math was simple. Stay neutral and die slowly under the weight of debt. Or fight and maybe win freedom. The Ottomans chose to fight, and the British made sure they would lose everything. The moment the war began, Britain sent an expeditionary force to Basra in southern Iraq. The official reason was to protect the oil refinery at Abadan, but the real mission was to march north and seize the oil fields of Mosul and Kirkuk before the Germans could get there. They were not fighting the Ottoman army. They were racing to foreclose on the collateral. The railway that was supposed to save the empire became the road map for its destruction. British forces moved north along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They followed the same route the railway was meant to follow. The fighting was savage. British soldiers died of heat stroke and dysentery. Ottoman forces won shocking victories like the Siege of Kut, where an entire British division surrendered. But the Ottomans could not sustain the fight. Why? Because the railway was not finished. There were gaps in the line through the Taurus Mountains. German supplies had to be unloaded from trains, carried by truck or camel over the passes, and then reloaded onto trains on the other side. This bottleneck strangled the entire war effort. Ammunition arrived too late. Reinforcements could not move fast enough. The railway that was meant to be the empire's salvation became the symbol of its failure. By 1916, the British had seized Baghdad. By 1917, they had taken Jerusalem. And in a back room in London, 2 diplomats were drawing lines on a map. Their names were Mark Sykes and Francois Georges Picot. They did not wait for the war to end. They divided the Ottoman Empire into British and French zones of influence. But here is what nobody tells you. Those lines were not random. If you overlay the Sykes-Picot map with the route of the Baghdad Railway and the locations of known oil deposits, they match almost perfectly. Britain claimed Iraq and the port of Haifa. France claimed Syria and Lebanon. They were carving up the carcass along the exact path of the railway. They were liquidating the assets. On October 30th, 1918, the Ottoman Empire signed the Armistice of Madras. The war was over. The empire had lost. But the true cost was not measured in soldiers. It was measured in gold. The empire's debt had ballooned to over £400 million. Its treasury was empty. Its tax base was destroyed. The victors did not just take territory. They took everything. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration remained in place. The new nations carved out of the empire, Iraq, Syria, and Transjordan, inherited portions of the debt. The railway was divided into separate sections, controlled by different colonial powers. The dream of a unified trade route from Berlin to Baghdad was dead. But the debt lived on. Turkey, the successor state to the Ottoman Empire, continued making payments to British and French creditors until 1954. That is 36 years after the war ended. An entire generation grew up in poverty because their grandparents had tried to build a railway. Let me tell you what this really means. The Ottoman Empire did not fall because of military defeat. It fell because it could not pay its bills. It borrowed money to modernize. It borrowed more money to service the debt. It built infrastructure with foreign capital and turned its sovereignty into collateral. When the war came, the creditors foreclosed. They took the land. They took the oil. They took the future. And they left behind a bill that would take decades to pay off. This is not ancient history. This is the blueprint. Look at the world today. Look at the Belt and Road Initiative. China is building railways and ports across Asia, Africa, and Europe. It is offering loans to countries that are desperate for infrastructure. The United States and Europe are warning those countries to stay away. They call the Chinese projects debt traps. They say China is buying influence. But the language is identical to what Britain said about Germany in 1900. The anxiety is the same. The fear is the same. A rising industrial power is trying to bypass the naval choke points controlled by the dominant empire. And the dominant empire is preparing to stop it. The Middle East is still the battleground. The wars in Iraq and Syria, the tensions with Iran, the instability in Turkey. All of these conflicts happen along the same fault lines where the Baghdad Railway was supposed to run. The geography has not changed. The resources have not moved. The struggle for control over the corridor that connects Europe and Asia is still the central conflict of global power. The train that never finished is still shaping the world. Here is the lesson. Infrastructure is never neutral. A railway is not just a railway. It is a vector of power. It determines who trades with whom. It determines who gets rich and who stays poor. And the powers that control the current system will destroy anything that threatens to replace it. They will use propaganda. They will use financial blockades. And if necessary, they will use war. The Ottoman Empire thought it could use German capital to escape British control. Instead, it became the battlefield where two empires fought for the future. The Ottomans were not the players. They were the prize. And when the game was over, they were divided and sold. Sovereignty is solvency. If you cannot pay your debts, you do not control your destiny. If you build your future with someone else's money, you're not building independence. You are building dependence. The Sultan learned this. The empire learned this. And the rubble of that lesson is still scattered across the deserts of Iraq and Syria. This is not a story about the past. This is a warning about the present. When you see infrastructure projects making headlines, when you see loans being offered and refused, when you see powers competing for influence in distant regions, you are watching the same game that destroyed the Ottoman Empire. The players have changed. The technology has improved. But the rules are written in the ledger, and the ledger does not forgive. Subscribe to this channel if you want to see the patterns before they repeat. History does not announce itself. It whispers in the footnotes of loan agreements and the fine print of treaties. Empires do not collapse because of invasions. They collapse because of interest rates. The wars we remember are just the loud part. The real decisions happen in boardrooms and bank vaults, and those decisions determine everything. If you think this story is about trains and old maps, you have missed the point. This story is about who controls the flow of resources in the 21st century. It is about whether the next global system will be built on rails or on shipping lanes. It is about whether economic power will shift east or remain anchored in the west. And it is about what happens to the countries caught in the middle, the ones who need development but cannot afford the price, the ones who take the loans and wake up to find they have sold their sovereignty. The Baghdad Railway was never finished, but the war it started never really ended. The borders it created are still bleeding. The debts it generated are still being paid in blood and oil. And the lesson it teaches is the most important one in geopolitics. Follow the money, follow the resources, follow the infrastructure, because that is where the future is decided. Not in speeches, not in treaties, in the cold, hard math of the balance sheet. The train that never arrived is still destroying the world. Now you know why. Now you know how. And now you know what to watch for, because it is happening again, right now, in real time. The same trap is being set, the same promises are being made, and the same ending is waiting at the end of the line. Only those who study the ledger will see it coming. Only those who understand that history is written in debt will know what happens next. Subscribe now and stay ahead, because when the tracks are laid and the bills come due, it will be too late to ask questions. The foreclosure will already be underway.